So if you respond to someone with interest and then it gets into sort of really negotiating the details, what are some things artists should consider in terms of either asking for pay or just whether they should know to accept a sort of standard fee deal? How's all that money stuff work?
Yeah, well, again, I guess a couple points that I'll make for that, and it seems that I'm kind of highlighting things that I keep saying, but they just change a little bit in the detail with professionalism. But again, know the market and the venue. If we're talking about a place like Broadway on Nashville or Bleecker Street or whatever, like a lot of those venues pretty much pay the same amount to every single musician, no matter what the slot is. When I was younger, a lot of times it was $100 plus tips. It's $100 a man plus tips. It's 100 a man plus tips. So if you're going for a gig that's kind of like that, that's what it's going to be. Because again, a lot of these rooms, they know that they're going to be crowded no matter what. And the audience isn't necessarily there just to hear what you do. They're just there for live music and a couple of beers. So knowing what that's going to be. So that's an example of like a room like that. Is it a ticketed event? If it's a ticketed event, is it X amount versus the door? Do you get the full door price? Is it a guarantee versus the door? A lot of times, some of the venues we do that where the band needs X to come out, but we will take the risk with you up till however the day performs. Is it a private gig? I personally believe that private gigs should cost more money unless you're doing a favor for somebody because they're paying for a specific service. It usually requires you bringing a PA and all that. So a lot of times I'd say the money for a private event should be higher. And then obviously how many people are competing for a gig? If you're in a place where it's a hot spot all the time and the bands just want to play there, you probably won't have the negotiating power for something like that. So I'd say that's one is know the room and know the market that you're playing and find out what musicians are making around there if you possibly can. And then know your rate. Sometimes a buyer will ask you that. What is your rate? And yes, sometimes that will affect. A lot of times I'll come back with, well, we can't do that. We can only do this. But it gives a sense of it. So try to figure out maybe what a fair rate is for you and whether that fair rate is this is how much money I need to make today because I'm on tour and this is how much it costs to put gas in the van. Then
Yeah.
that might affect what your rate is. Have a sense of it because somebody might ask you.
Do you have for artists that, especially artists that maybe are starting out and they're playing a wide variety of venues, and so I think in that situation it's challenging to figure out, well, I don't know what my rate is. It feels like I just got paid $500 over here. I got door split over here. Is there some general windows that you have observed over, the years of doing this that, hey, bands that are in this part of their career, they're getting in this range, and bands that have these things going on are getting more of this range over here? Any guidance?
Well, I mean, it yes and no. It is as insane as you explained it. Sometimes can be. I mean, the range that my band makes is quite the span. Again, depending on it. I think we had talked about that earlier, but unless you're dealing with a corporate event or something like that, I think typically a lot of people will start to be reflecting on your draw. My band plays a certain venue and we were able to, when they had originally just announced the event, it had only sold okay. It sold about 1,000 tickets. And by the time they announced our band was playing, it sold another 4,000 to 5,000 tickets. And I went, whoa, okay, I guess that's our value. I was pleasantly surprised too. It's going to get to a certain point where who's coming to see you play. I mean, there's definitely a way to build your way up to a certain rate. The word on the street from what I hear with a lot of these different cover rooms is you're making like somewhere between $100 and $150 a person plus tips. That's generally what I hear. If there's some travel involved, usually you can try to, goose that a little bit because you're also going to be paying for some gas. But for a lot of different cover rooms, that's what I've heard, which is how a lot of people start out. I can tell you that the deal at Rockwood Music Hall in New York City, if you're playing Rockwood 1, is it's based on Pass the Hat. And I'm sure there are plenty of listening rooms in Nashville. Kevin, you could probably speak to that better than me, that probably have a similar deal because it's people just there doing their art.
Yeah.
But if you're playing a bigger event, if you know that this place is going to be packed and they're just really want something quality, that's probably indicating that you're good. So there will be some budget there. Now you might not be able to justify asking for $30K because you didn't move the tickets. Well, I mean, that is a thing that musicians can look forward to. I mean, I know a couple bands that are not that big unless you're in that scene and they do make $30K plus production. So like it is a possibility to get to that level without being on the cover of Rolling Stone. But it is very much based on their draw.
The biggest fear artists have, at least, well, I could say, whenever my band is negotiating this, it's like, we don't want to ask for 2 or 3 grand and find out, oh, we were ready to pay 10. Well, we'll take the 3 grand deal instead, like the venue. Like, I think that's the concern that artists are like, I don't want to lowball myself. And when the venue was, or the buyer was willing to pay 3-4 times that much, or I also don't want to ask for too much and then be like, oh, get the heck out of here, what are you talking about? And I think that's where artists feel this tension, like they want the gig, but they
Yeah.
want to make sure, and they're most likely going to take it either way, but they want to make sure they're not giving away money.
Yeah, kind of like I want to ask her out, but I don't want to hear no.
Yeah.
I don't want to know I really like her. Yeah,
She's
but,
gonna say yes either way. So are we going to McDonald's or a nice steak
yes.
place?
Again, I think that's why it's good to know your rate. So what I do personally for my band, if I'm in a new relationship and or if I'm in a new market, is I'll essentially say, hey, look, here's the deal. For gigs like this, I usually make X.
Okay.
But but I'm willing to work with you. Let me know. Because what my hope is that other talent, and it's unfortunately it's definitely not always the case, but that a lot of talent buyers approach things like me, like, okay, they're willing to work with it. Now, if that was it, I personally, as a talent buyer, if they really lowball themselves, I'm like, no, we're gonna do this. Like I've actually
Okay.
bumped, I personally have bumped bands before because I'm like, that's ridiculous. You shouldn't play for that much money.
Yeah.
We had a
Go ahead.
speaker at one of our past DIY musician conferences. I think it was Gregory Hyde, but he would say, if you can in the same breath say, this is my rate, is that in your budget? You both
Yeah.
state your worth, but you keep it an open question so that there can be a little bit of like, oh, we really can't afford that. And then he still can like read your facial expressions and be like, well, I could do it for less. Or it's like, kind of
Yeah,
keeps
I mean, that
all the possibilities in that one phrase.
I mean, I personally, I mean, and obviously there's whatever that Hunter S. Thompson quote was about the entertainment industry, the music industry, about it's full of crooks and slime or whatever in the gutter, and then there's the bad half. I personally, as an artist and therefore as a talent buyer, I just rather approach things honestly and somewhat directly because I just don't want to deal with a lot of stuff. So yes, like what you said is like, I usually get this much. Is that within your budget? Or I'm willing to work with you, or whatever that is. I usually just start with that, and you got to know what your cutoff is going to be. Don't be so desperate for the gig that you devalue yourself either, is honestly my artist advice too. I know it sounds weird coming from a talent buyer who represents venues, but don't play a gig that you're not happy with because that's going to show on the gig too. So again, knowing your rate, say, okay, I usually make this, but what are you working with, or something like that. And then they might come back to you. And usually I think it's pretty amicable. But I've had experiences like that, both as a talent buyer and as an artist, where we usually come to something that's agreeable for both. It's not very often where I walk away.
So if you have extras to sort of throw into the deal, like lodging or dinner or bar tab or whatever, does sort of every artist that comes through get that, or is that negotiable for each act based on the night?
It is negotiable, I'd say. For me, typically at some of our venues, if you're going to do a double header, you get lodging your first night. Is typically what the deal is. Obviously, if a band has a huge draw and they're going to draw thousands and thousands of people, usually that's a one night anyway. So I guess that's a moot point. So
Yeah.
if you're staying 2 nights for us, we usually do put the artist up, especially when we're out on Nantucket, because 2 days out in Nantucket, you obviously need somewhere to stay, and it's not the cheapest of places to stay. So yeah, I mean, ask. The squeaky wheel gets the grease. You never will get if you don't ask also. So a lot of times I will tell bands like, hey, we can put you up on this. But my advice as an artist is always ask. And if they say, no, we don't provide lodging, you say, do you have a deal with anybody nearby? I've played at venues where like, we can't do that, but we can do a buyout of this. And there's a place down the road that does it for this. So feel free to ask the questions after the gig is booked.